We want to welcome you to the second Keithley Symposium here at the CMA. And in order to get us started, I'm going to welcome to the stage our illustrious director, William Griswold, who is going to offer welcoming remarks. We're so happy to have you here, and we hope you will enjoy the day. Bill.
Thank you so much, Kijo. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Griswold, as you've heard, director of the Cleveland Museum of Art, and I am really delighted to welcome you to the museum and to our second biennial Keithley Symposium. The Keithley Symposium is co-organized by the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Department of Art History and Art at Case Western Reserve University, under the auspices of the museum's and the university's now over 50-year-old joint program in art history. This symposium brings together scholars and artists and students and members of the general public from throughout Northeast Ohio and beyond to explore the complex intersection of art and society. It has been 3 years since we hosted the first Keithley Symposium, and after the pandemic upended our plans in 2020, we're extremely grateful to be together in person for this year's event. This has been a long time coming. In 2019, the CMA and Case Western Reserve University embarked on an exciting and fruitful collaboration with Monument Lab, an internationally known creative studio based in Philadelphia, whose projects ask us to think deeply about what is memorialized in our public spaces and about how that memorialization is evoked. Today, the CMA, Case Western Reserve University, and Monument Lab will examine the topic of monuments and public history right here in Cleveland. The title and topic of this year's symposium is Monumental Conversations, City Stories, and each of today's panels will consider two questions from multiple angles. First, what is the story of Cleveland? And second, where does it live? In the first session, Place Memory, the organizing collaborators are going to discuss from their personal and institutional perspectives the reasons that public memory is critically important today. Then after lunch, we'll return for another in-depth discussion, What Makes a Monument?, during which our panelists will engage with Monument Lab's broad definition of monuments as statements of power and presence in public. The third session, Who Makes Public Memory?, will address the many ways that public memory is established and marked in Cleveland. And then finally, we'll hear from several Clevelanders who share their stories of Cleveland and how those narratives are memorialized. Audience questions will be invited throughout today's program. I would like, above all, to offer our collective gratitude to Nancy and Joe Keithley for their generous support of the Keithley Symposium and for their creative vision in initiating the Keithley Institute, which will play an essential role in the short and long-term future of our historic joint program in art history and museum studies. Without the Keithleys, we would not have the pleasure of one another's company today, or of hearing from scholars and artists and members of our own community about this expansive and important topic. Please join me in thanking Nancy and Joe. I would also like to express my enormous appreciation to our colleagues at Case Western Reserve University, notably Ben Vinson III, Provost and Executive Vice President, and Betsy Bolman, Elizabeth Bolman, Elsie B. Smith Professor in the Liberal Arts and Chair of the Department of Art History and Art. It's a joy and it's a privilege for us to have the opportunity to work so closely with them and with their colleagues in co-organizing this symposium and in planning the future of the Keithley Institute as well as the joint program. I am particularly proud to announce today that the Keithley Symposium has been selected as a representative project of Case Western Reserve University's Pathway 3, a university-wide initiative to increase social impact. In addition, I want to convey my tremendous gratitude to Ki-Jo Lee, Director of Academic Affairs and Associate Curator of Special Projects here at the CMA. And I'd like to convey my appreciation to Charles Kang, Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Art History Leadership at the CMA and at Case Western Reserve University, to Hannah Hilditch, Academic Programs Coordinator, and CWRU Graduate Fellows Samantha Truman, Jillian Cruz, and Ben Levy for their tireless work in planning this event. Today's symposium represents your agile thinking over a period that has presented many unforeseen challenges, and you have transformed those challenges into opportunities for which we are at once impressed and deeply grateful. I would also like to thank the members of the CMA CWRU Academic Program Advisory Committee, Joe and Nancy Keithley, as well as Virginia Barbato, Tim Callahan, Ellen Mavick, Scott Mueller, and Ron Richard, for their vision and guidance as we chart the future path of the Keithley Institute and the joint program. And of course, it is an enormous honor to be collaborating with Monument Lab, and I'm thrilled to welcome Paul Farber, Director of Monument Lab, and Nico Rodriguez, Associate Director of Projects. We marvel at your research and at your vision, and we are very, very pleased to be with you today. This symposium is but the first part of a multi-part event. Throughout 2022, we'll offer a series of community-centered conversations both at the CMA and on the university's campus. We will simultaneously work with institutional and community partners to cross-promote a range of related programs and activities with common themes. Moreover, Monument Lab and the CMA are working together on a temporary installation to be unveiled in summer 2022, and then finally, this time next year, we'll reconvene to bring the rich discussion of monuments that we're beginning today to a conclusion. We hope that you'll be so inspired by today's conversation that you'll join us when we gather again in December 2022, and that you'll wish to be with us throughout the year as we invite members of the community to take part in focused discussions. And so, let's get started. To introduce our first panel, it is my pleasure and privilege to give the podium to Heather Lemonedes, Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the CMA, and yet another key player in our vibrant partnership with Ben, Betsy, and Case Western Reserve. Heather.
Thank you, Bill, and hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm glad to be with you. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce the first panel, in which we will get to meet the organizing collaborators of this symposium. They will tell us about how this symposium came about and discuss the importance of addressing monuments and memory at this moment in time. First, I would like to introduce Betsy Bolman, the Elsie B. Smith Professor in the Liberal Arts and Professor and Chair of the Department of Art and Art History at Case Western Reserve University. Betsy, as many of you know, is a renowned historian of the visual culture of the Eastern Mediterranean and late antique and Byzantine periods. Her expertise in Christian Egyptian art is best demonstrated by her 2016 book, The Red Monastery Church, Beauty and Asceticism in Upper Egypt. This book resulted from a decade-long multidisciplinary project in which she complemented a rigorous historical study of rare and spectacular early Byzantine paintings at this important site by spearheading their cleaning and conservation. Currently, Betsy is leading multiple initiatives that incorporate cutting-edge technologies for expanding the pedagogical possibilities of art history while also pursuing a research project on Byzantine depictions of the nursing Virgin Mary through a gender studies perspective. Her work has received fellowships, grants, and awards from numerous prestigious organizations, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the United States Agency for International Development. Betsy received her AB from Smith College and her MA and PhD from Bryn Mawr. Our next panelist is Paul M. Farber, a prolific curator, historian, and educator. He's director of Monument Lab while also serving as a senior research scholar at the Center for Public Art and Space at the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Paul's research and curatorial projects explore transnational urban history, cultural memory, and creative approaches to civic engagement, consistently touching upon some of the most pertinent issues in our society today and demonstrating the rare gift of bringing multiple stakeholders together for meaningful actions. Among Paul's wide-ranging publications, I will highlight Monument Lab, Creative Speculations for Philadelphia, a book that he co-edited with the artist Kem Lum, a public art and history handbook designed to generate new critical ways of thinking about and building monuments. And I'm sure we'll touch on that book today. Paul engages with a wide range of audiences through outlets such as The Guardian and NPR, and his powerful method of bringing and bridging advanced research and creative practice has landed him on Dell's inaugural #Inspire100 list, a group of world changers who use technology to empower social change. Farber received a BA in Urban Studies from the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD in American Culture from the University of Michigan. And lastly, I am delighted to introduce Ki-Jo Lee, Director of Academic Affairs and Associate Curator of Special Projects here at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Ki-Jo designs and implements programs to inspire scholarly engagement with our museum's collections. Alongside creating opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students to engage with the humanities and to explore museum careers, she develops and oversees the CMA's academic institutional partnerships. To all of this work, Ki-Jo brings her multifaceted scholarly expertise in American art history, the history of photography, and African American studies, as well as museum education. She will soon be making her impact as a curator with her first exhibition, Currents and Constellations, Black Art in Focus, that will open in the Julia and Larry Pollock Focus Gallery at the CMA on February 20th, 2022. And this exhibition will be accompanied by a companion publication. I'm very much looking forward to both. Ki-Jo earned a BA in art history at Douglas College and a dual MA in art history and African American studies from Yale University. And she is currently a PhD candidate at Yale, looking forward to finishing very, very soon. And her dissertation is entitled Precarious Matters: Photography, Physics, and Blackness. Betsy, Paul, and Ki-Jo, we are delighted to be here with you this morning as you discuss the importance of monuments and memory today. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you. Well, I'm so happy to be on the stage with the two of you. For our audience, basically the arrangement of this is a conversation. There will be some slides in it, but it is really about us unpacking for you how and why we are thinking about monuments in this place at this moment and over actually the last year and a half or almost 2 years. And so what I will first do is turn it over to Betsy Bolman, who will sort of recapture the initiating thoughts that brought us here today. And then Paul will talk and give us a little bit more grounding about Monument Lab, as well as why it was important for him to participate in this project. And then we will all speak about what our ideas are of place memory from both a personal and institutional standpoint. So with that, I will hand it over to Betsy Bolman.
Well, I'm so excited to be here. I can't begin to tell you. This is such a privilege. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the wonderful introductions, for all the great collaboration. So a quarter of a century of my life has been spent on one monument, conserving it, studying it, publishing it, documenting it. I'm not going to be talking about that monument today, but you see me here on the screen with some Coptic Orthodox monks and a bishop. I'll be talking about monuments, and I want to set the stage by discussing a few issues I think that are germane to our entire day's discussion. Size, purpose, memory, the power of the visual. We'll be questioning monumental topographies. I'll be expressing some thoughts on why people destroy monuments, and I'll be ending with my favorite Cleveland monument before I turn things over. So this preparation for this symposium began as a kind of adventure with graduate students in my department. We undertook a class called The Public Lives of Monuments, and the monuments that the students chose to work on were both monumental, as you see here, with Chief Wahoo and one of the guardians of traffic, but they were also small. You see here these very well-known iron sculptures in Coventry. So for me, monuments can be big and they can be small. And what makes them monumental for me is their presence and their significance. So monuments are fundamentally about people, the people who dreamed them up, the people who made them, and those of us who look at them. They exist in complex social networks and they have agency. And I think this issue of agency and people are really profound aspects of monuments. Monuments are not just sitting there forever. They were put there because people imagined them and people made them, and then we are looking at them, and they have agency. They're not accidental or neutral or inevitable. They're born out of desire. One of the types of desire that's commonly seen in monuments is the desire to commemorate, which basically means to create memories. Now, remembering in the ancient world, and in my opinion, is a creative act. Plato described memories as being visual and three-dimensional in nature, as being imprinted on wax. He underscored the power of the visual when it comes to memories. Whatever is imprinted, we remember and know as long as its image lasts. But whatever is rubbed out or cannot be imprinted, we forget and do not know. In the ancient world and the Byzantine world, sight was considered to be the highest of the senses. What the eye sees, it appropriates. You see things, they come in, and they affect you. Memories are creative, and monuments can express them. Monuments function socially for better, as we see in this marvelous free stamp that makes us think about all kinds of aspects of freedom and lack of freedom. It makes me think, sitting here, of the privilege of living in a city where a world-class museum is free and open to the public. So monuments can function socially for better, or also for worse. And so here's a statue of Edward Colston, a slave trader in Bristol that has been the focus of a considerable amount of attention over the last couple of years. One intervention, rather than pulling the statue down or graffitiing the statue, an anonymous artist created a kind of mock-up of what slaves' bodies were made to do, what people who were made to be slaves were forced to do in ships that brought them across the ocean. And so you see a diagram on the right that shows how many people you can fit into a ship, and on the left, a kind of physical embodiment of that. And so that immediately creates a kind of conversation between this man up there on the pedestal and then these bodies that are chained below him. And of course, some people didn't feel like that was enough, and they did graffiti him, and they did pull down this statue. And I say him, it's an it, but I'm saying him as if it's a person. Interesting. And so they threw him into Bristol Harbor, and the city of Bristol paid a lot of money to pull him out again. And right now, the statue is lying on its side, which I think is a really interesting way to represent it. They're, to the best of my knowledge, not cleaning off the graffiti. They're not pretending it didn't happen. They're not putting it back up on the pedestal. Some other interventions happened on that pedestal. A man named Mark Quinn created a statue of a young African woman, African-British woman named Jen Reed. And you see a detail of the statue on the left, and you see her in front of it on the right. The city of Bristol decided that that was not an officially sanctioned statue, and so they took it down. And I think, if I'm not out of date, the question of what precisely is going to happen with this is still a little bit open-ended. Monuments can also be subverted in ways that are not what I would consider to be creative and socially relevant. So we're looking here at the Roman Theater in Palmyra, and the so-called Islamic State chose it as a stage to murder people. Palmyra is one of my favorite places in the world. It's an extraordinary site in Syria, and the so-called Islamic State co-opted the Roman theater there because monuments convey authority and power. And so they were appropriating a place designed for entertainment and making it a site of mass murder. And of course, they videotaped this and they posted it online, and so these things are part of our global memories. And in this image on the right, you see one of the bombs that the so-called Islamic State set off in the city of Palmyra. The destruction of cultural heritage in the Middle East is a topic of great concern to me personally, and I'm sure to everyone in this room. And one of the topics that comes up often when you discuss this is, why are you worried about monuments and not worried about people? I think that's a really profound and important question. What is the relevance of monuments when people are being oppressed and killed? So Irina Bokova, former Director General of UNESCO, said that the dichotomy of people or monuments is a false one, that it's people and monuments. And she called what the so-called Islamic State was doing by destroying monuments in Syria as cultural erasure, as an attempt to erase traces of a past civilization so that it didn't conflict with the narratives of the so-called Islamic State. Monuments are the physical embodiment of culture, beliefs, and ideals, and they matter. And they matter in the past, but they also matter in the present. So we see on the lower right a photograph of the deceased distinguished archaeologist Khaled al-Assad, who was considered to be the father of Palmyra and who hid many of the treasures of Palmyra and refused, even under torture, to reveal their location to the so-called Islamic State, and so they killed him. And this is his son holding the portrait. So ancient monuments have relevance today. They have relevance to people, and they're important in people's lives. So what does this all have to do with Cleveland? Well, we're going to be exploring that today, and my favorite monument in Cleveland is University Circle. So it's a whole bunch of monuments that combine to create an important place with a lot of memories. University Circle for me is large, it's collaborative, it values the arts, it fosters knowledge, and in it we are engaged in creative memory making and storytelling, and that's one of our projects today and for the next year. It's also a source of pride. Unlike some places in this country, we have the privilege of not having statues of Confederate generals and slave owners. Frederick Douglass gave the Western Reserve College commencement address in 1854, and the corner of Euclid and Adelbert marks one of the spots on the Underground Railroad. And so with that, I think I'm gonna turn things over.
I think that's a great place. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you so much. Yes, for setting the stage for us so well. Yeah, Paul, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Kijo. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Just to, there's a lot in your presentation, so just I want to give everyone a moment to breathe in and breathe out and absorb the enormity and also the fine-grained feelings as well. So being here is no small task or order, to be in the room with all of you. This is a long time coming, and it's not to be, the treat of it is not to be taken lightly. So before I begin and share more about Monument Lab and our work, I want to express profound gratitude to everybody in this room. It's kind of a miracle and a testament. And just to say, we started planning this in before times, before the pandemic. We kept trying to make headway throughout the pandemic, trying to predict horizons and moving ahead, and it was thanks to great and thoughtful leadership, especially from the two of you, that got us to even this point. And also to everyone here in the audience and anyone who's gonna be seeing the recording, just profound gratitude. And all the people who made it possible for us to be in this room. I'm thinking visitor services, I'm thinking security, I'm thinking about the tech crew. We now understand that our life in public can fall apart quickly, so when it gets put back together, it takes all of us, so just noting that. I'm here representing Monument Lab. We're a nonprofit public art and history studio based in Philadelphia. For me, I'm also an educator, a historian, a curator, a person who's been thinking about memory throughout my life. I grew up in a Jewish household. I'm queer, and I thought a lot about how memory has taught me about the past, but also brought the past into the present. And here on behalf of Monument Lab, there's a lot of us. Some of us are based in Philadelphia, some are in New Orleans and New York, and other places. And I want to just give you a sense of the kind of work we do, and also, again, in gratitude, being invited by the CMA and by CRU, the new acronym, or the new saying of the acronym, what kind of questions we like to bring to our work. So just to say, Monument Lab started in a classroom. I was teaching a class on memory monuments in urban space. I met Ken Lum, an artist and curator and professor who was also teaching classes in public art. We realized that we were kindred spirits, and we started connecting with other kindred spirits, members of our team, researchers, librarians, our students, and of course, artists. And our work spilled out of the classroom, and we experimented in public space, and we started our work in really asking questions about monuments, understanding that while monuments are central to our zeitgeist, through our cultural consciousness, to a lot of our cities and towns, they actually remain elusive. They don't speak for themselves. There's no one definition of a monument, which I'll talk more about. So we started to see, well, what happens when you theorize public space while in public space and try to connect conversations? And I want to be really clear, when we started our work in 2012, we felt like we were late to the conversation. Because as our work was growing and as we were asking questions, we already had seen a generation of artists, activists, of scholars, of students, asking questions about symbols and systems in public. As time went on in the course of doing our work, again, we kind of want to make sure that we note, while we'd like to be able to advance the conversation, we have to constantly be learning and listening to the conversations already happening somewhere. And I think that's the spirit we want to bring to our work here. And speaking of that, while we have worked with contemporary artists across the country and now outside of the country, at the heart of our work is inquiry and learning. And so here's an example of one of our labs. We're really glad to now have a headquarters in Philadelphia in an old firehouse owned by a monument conservator. But before that, there was no monument and there was no lab. We would set up shop in shipping containers in public parks, museum lobbies, library mezzanines, university classrooms, and hallways. Because for us, actually, it was always about the cross-section. And in our work, we've paid high school students, paid college students, paid teaching artists and educators and social workers who are already doing work on memory, again, tapping into what is already there. And I would just say this early, if you're like, oh, how do I get involved? What can I do? Well, first, you gotta find the people already doing the work and see how you cross together. To also be clear, we were not a municipal agency, but we'd often be confused for one because we'd show up in public space. What we found in our work, asking tens of thousands of people in person, engaging with hundreds of thousands of people in public spaces, face-to-face, pre-pandemic and now through it, and millions online, is that there was no one definition of monument. So we've come up with one based on those conversations, that monuments are statements of power and presence in public. When we keep learning, when we ask people, what is a monument? What is an appropriate monument? How would you map the monuments of a city? Is that some people think about bronze and marble figures on high, often untouchable, seeming like they're there forever, though we know they're not. But people have also used the word monument to talk about other traces of the past and the present. Archaeological sites, sites that have been erased, places where memory lives. That if you have the time, the money, and the official power, you build a monument that's important to you, it also embeds your place in social standing. If you don't have the time, the money, the official power, you have power nonetheless. You build your own monument, or you gather around a monument that exists, and that is how you, in part, make your presence felt. Another thing just to note, and I think this picks up on some of what Betsy was sharing, is that, and this might sound cutesy, but I want to talk about why are monuments focal points of activism, of agitation, of organizing. It's a lot easier to organize around a statue than a statute, which is to say that if monuments are statements of power and presence in public and have been built across generations, especially to reinforce systems of power, that I'll talk more about in a moment, how do you engage that? Well, it's not an either or. It's not take on symbols or systems. It's understanding how to draw power from that which exists to exemplify and embody and expand your own. Monument Lab grew from being a passion project to really an organization over the last year, and in part that's because of a lot of dedicated work from our team and a transformative grant from the Mellon Foundation, who were embarking on a major $250 million investment in telling a fuller history of our nation through monuments in public space. We were the inaugural grantees, very honored to be put in that position, and as a part of that, to really kick off the Monuments Project, we did a national monument audit, which was released in late September. You can read it online, you can search the data, you can order a copy on monumentlab.com. Something I want to talk about with the audit, there's a common misconception, I've had it actually, that there is some central agency out there that has a list of all the monuments and knows, is in charge of them, right? They should add this one, take this one down. Let's just get that list, and that will tell us all of the things of monuments, when they were built, who paid for them, to whom or to what they're dedicated. This is something that's reflected not just in our ideas, but in media headlines and conversations I've had with very thoughtful people. The truth is the opposite. Monuments are a collection of a variety of ways that people have imprinted memory and power in place. They are sanctioned by federal, state, local, tribal, institutional, unaffiliated partners. They have an aura of permanence, but are not permanent in of themselves. Nothing is permanent. They require maintenance, money, and mindsets to keep them up. So if you want to know about monuments, not just as one-off symbols, but as a collection, as a pattern, what do? So our team, and giving a lot of credit and love to a 30-person team, including co-editors along with myself, Sue Mobley, our director of research, and Lori Allen, our senior research advisor, we led this project where what we did is dive into existing data sets, gathered at all those levels, federal, state, local, tribal, publicly assembled, that were not built to gather the stories of monuments, because there's not even a consensus on what a monument is, but out of historic properties, cemeteries, markers. And we created algorithms and worked on checking that research to gather a study set of nearly 50,000 conventional monuments, 48,178 to be precise, and then put it out as a public tool. You could search our data, you can take a look at it, you can also read some of the press. We wanted to have a conversation about monuments like we are today. Of course, some of my favorite ones are up here as well. And sorry, there's one slide missing here. I'll pause here and just say, when we talk about the study set, we're talking not about a tally of everything that could ever be called a monument. It is instead what people on a local, on a federal, on a state level have been gathering as part of the monument landscape. I'm not sure why slides are missing, but I'm going to go forward with it. And what I want to tell you is an idea that comes out from our audit. The 4 findings were that monuments have always changed. The monument landscape is predominantly and overrepresented by white male figures. War and conquest are the most common features of our monument landscape, and that the monuments that are currently, the story of the United States as told by our current monument landscape misrepresents our history. I want to talk about that. Of our nearly 50,000 monuments, we found 5,917 to be exact, have mentions of the Civil War. Of that, 1% mention slavery. And I'm saying mention slavery. In the title, in the plaque, in the metadata, the Civil War was undoubtedly fought over slavery. So while we can respond to a symbol here or there, what do we do with that history? We know, of course, nearly 1,000 monuments that are recorded that mention pioneer, and only 15% of them even mention Native American, Indian, or Indigenous. That's not counting pejorative terms. And we know that over half of them were installed after 1930, after a period of mythologizing the frontier and the Hollywoodization of the West, but also after armed conflict and forced dispossession of native lands across this country. So when we think about monuments, I also want to note in our study, 99.4% of monuments were not toppled in the last 2 years. So from there, this comes our vision statement for Monument Lab. Monuments must change. It can be catalytic and profound to respond to a monument here or there, to add or subtract. I don't want to take away from that. It is really important. And if we are to live to our creed, if we are to really understand the past into the present, we have to imagine new ways. This slideshow has come out of order, so I'm gonna I will end here and say, even with this intense information, with the study, our group is still inspired, because what we hear is that despite all of those factors, despite the weight of history, we keep meeting people and keep finding their stories that remind us that we can repair and reimagine how history lives with us every day. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Paul. And I do not have a PowerPoint. Anyone who knows me, you'll know from my hands what I'm talking about. I think taking up both things that you said, Betsy, and that you said, Paul, maybe my thoughts will connect us to the title of this plenary, Place Memory. And so, because in many ways, for me, I see monuments like I see archives, right? This sort of collection of things that were selected by people who were official and or unofficial. When I think about traditional archives, like those that reside here at the museum or in university collections, I'm always thinking about who decided that these pieces of paper, this ephemera, this pocket watch belongs in an archive, and what preoccupies me is what's outside of that. So whenever I'm approaching a monument, I'm often invested in what's there, but really distracted by what's not, because I think about place memory as an aggregation, an accumulation, both of the thoughts and ideas that were invested in it at the moment that it was created, but also the people who were not a part of that decision making, every person who has passed by or through that space, as well as, I love physics, so molecularly, right? We leave our leavings all over, and they combine and recombine and make these other things occur. And so for me, it's really important, and that's what interested me so much in working with Monument Lab, in helping to steward this project, is that for me, one of the things that I've heard over and over in museum work is we need to be listening to our communities. And I keep thinking, how are we not also part of that community? So to me, how do we validate the conversations that we're having in unofficial capacities and think about how they can reverberate and how they make new kinds of connections and new sorts of memories, and how we can do so, as we're doing right now, through the process of having conversations about these monuments. And so to Betsy, when you were thinking of your favorite monuments in Cleveland, for me, the two monuments that come to mind as my favorite, because of this idea of aggregation and accumulation, are the Thinker statue, the Rodin Thinker that is at the south entrance of the museum, which some of you may know was bombed in 1970. And an epithet on the side basically read, "F the rich," right? And it made me think about the ways that when I bring museum audiences to that statue, often they don't even notice that the extremities have been blown out. Their minds kind of recombine it to make it look like a photograph they've seen or something like that. So often we have to stand there and talk for a while to get at that history. And so it's a silenced history, but it's still there. There's a friction that happens when you get people in a space where something has occurred and they don't know what, and they either purposely ignore it or jump right in, or there's something that there's a resistance to that friction. And the second thing is there is a project called the Jazz Temple Project by Carmen M. Lane, an artist here in Cleveland, who on the site of MoCA Cleveland, there used to be a space called the Jazz Temple that was created by a 19-year-old African-American young man named, Winston Willis. And in August of 1965, it was bombed. And so now that we see that beautiful diamond-like museum on that space, I had never known that there had been another history there. But it seemed to me to be, that intersection has always been a little bit strange to me, the way that the museum juts out there. Anyway, and I'm not from Cleveland originally, so Cleveland streets are confusing from jump. But I learned about that Jazz Temple project at the same time that another artist named Sandra Perry had an installation at MoCA called A Terrible Thing. And she was really interested in thinking about not only how humans shape space, but how space shapes humans. And so one of the inspirations for that project was she learned that when human skin touches metal, skin cells die upon contact, right? And so it made me really think about how do we mine those traces? What are the mechanisms we use to do so? And so I think that what we're trying to bring to the fore here is that is a combination, an accumulation of things, and we will never have a complete history of any space because memory is as much about forgetting as it is about what is retained. And what is retained, I loved what you said about it being a creative project. Because when we remember things, we often highlight certain feelings, this visceral reactions to things, and often can forget other parts. But I think that the pursuit of the forgotten is sort of my modus operandi and is what sort of feeds my investment in this project. So that to me allows us to sort of bring into relief that which has gone missing, but also that which has been erased, but also with always having the awareness that there will always be a slippage, there will always be something that's just out of reach, and if we can live in that space, then maybe we can have different conversations about the ways monuments can change, what it means to invest in a sort of global legacy or a global understanding of what monuments mean in different places to different people, to understand how I have a kind of Western bias around preservation and what that looks like. I have an investment in museums, it's why I work in one, but at the same time I hold that together with the notion that they are colonial institutions. What does it mean to work in a space that is about collecting? And finally, I'm really interested in what's going to happen to the toppled monuments. Where do they go? What happens when they are removed from public space? And museums seem to be the imminent repository for some of them. And all I can think of is, well, then what happens? Is it the role of the museum to then narrate all of these complicated histories? Is it the role of the museum to offer a space for conversation around these? Is it the museum's responsibility to think about harm in the context of monuments? And so for me, our project together helps to unpack those questions, not necessarily thinking we're going to be able to find a finite answer, because each of you in this space probably has a different notion about what should happen, what could happen, what you'd like to see, what's gone that you would love to have back. And that's what we really want to learn about. So it's really a mission of having not only community-driven scholarship, but community-led, community-collaborated, in which we are part of that same community, not meant to, even though we're on high at the moment, to deliver information from on high. And so I would love to hear from both of you, sort of how you define place memory, or what that phrase really means to you.
I want to jump in and say that I should have had one more point after the point about being proud to live in a place where right down the street there was a site of the Underground Railroad, and that is, we haven't made a First Nation acknowledgement. So you're talking about missing, things that are missing. That's something that's missing, and that's something that I'm personally not proud of. So, I mean, the history of the destruction of First Nation peoples. And we don't have a monument to that in University Circle, to the best of my knowledge. So anyway, Paul.
You know, I appreciate the idea that place is, on one hand, a kind of register for memory, a container, an archive, as you powerfully suggest, Kijo. And also as a place of forgetfulness, some of which is forced, some of which is purposeful, some of which is inevitable. I think that on one hand, there's this idea that history fits inside of statues, like statue equals history. People hold history. Statues are one sliver of a multiplicity of ways that memory is retained. I think just being really clear that the connections to power, connections to colonial projects, connections to projects of land dispossession are just as, to enslavement, redlining, we can go on, are just as part of history of monuments. They don't always rise to what's on the plaque. They don't always rise to what is being dedicated in the marker. So I think that like, I try to go somewhere and say, well, what is here, what's not here? And I'm just thinking about, my dissertation was about American artists in the Berlin Wall. And growing up in my Hebrew school, we didn't dream of going to Germany. We were told, actually, if you go back and try to retrace your family's history in Europe, you zigzag across the continent to avoid Germany. It's too weighted as a site of harm, as a site of trauma. And when people say don't do something, sometimes you go ahead and do it. So as a college student and then as a graduate student, I went back to Berlin. I have to say I felt more comfortable being Jewish and queer in Berlin than anywhere else in Europe. And I think part of that was encountering memorials and monuments that were as big as a city block, others small as a cobblestone, conversations with people. Also knowing, by the way, that there was an economic reparations program for families who had been exploited, deported, and murdered, and lost their livelihoods and homes. And there was a public education curriculum. It wasn't one or the other, right? In all of that, I have to say, I took, of course, like when I got there, I felt like I was walking through viscous material. Like it was like, ooh, I'm here. And a few things happened. One is I thought, where could I go in the United States that is not the condition, especially for Black and Indigenous folks? Where in this continent is not a part of that trauma? I also found in Berlin the stories of people who, despite all of that weight, found a sense of home, of belonging, of democracy. Folks like Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Leonard Freed, Shinkichi Tajiri, like any artist that I was empowered by in the United States had a Berlin story. And they went to Berlin, they didn't feel totally at home, but they felt a bit at home and they felt haunted, and it was that energy. Because I think what I also found, I was walking in these other footsteps, that not telling the lie, not brushing the history under the rug, letting the scars of this place live on the surface was more of a relief. And I wish I didn't have to traffic in that place, but that I did, that's an illusion that I could even have that option. That's a counterfactual, that's cognitive dissonance. We are inheriting a weighty history, and a lot of it lives in place. So I think about place memory in a few different ways regarding all of that, which is to say, place is about presence, place is about absence. Place is about home, place is about the impossibilities or the challenges of equity and justice when it comes to the notion of home. And I think that part of memory being a creative act is that artists and writers and educators have been able to map absence and presence, justice and belonging, and injustice and displacement at the same time. And I think we have the ability to do that. It's happening now.
Absolutely, yeah, the ways in which we can hold together, right, those histories. I think of things like images of our forefathers, right, of early presidents, and the ways that we can hold together the idea of greatness not always being good, of people invested with great power making devastating mistakes, and then what does it mean to live in the afterlife of those mistakes? And so for me, looking at monuments as archives, because I am always beating the drum that, yes, we think archives hold everything together still forever, but every single thing in archives is disintegrating just at slower rates than they would if they were out in the atmosphere. And so a lot of the ways that I think when we think of words like reckoning, for me it is how do we sit with loss? How do we sit with the loss of the myth? How do we sit with the loss of ancestral tales that we can't necessarily reclaim? And so, like, to that end, I think about the scholar Saidiya Hartman's book, Lose Your Mother, in which she goes on a search on the African continent, in West Africa specifically, to sort of see if she could feel her ancestry, to feel. And it's real, and that seeking was the actual result, because you can't actually find all the time. So I think that there's this, I feel like there's a way in which.
Yeah, I mean, just in responding to that, I think that there is room to have history that also braids together loss, and braids together the story, like the history and the historiography.
Right.
That history is not this hermetically sealed accounting of the past. And monument is definitely, as we write in the audit, not facts on a pedestal. That there are all these layers of interpretation. We will gain more. A lot of times you learn more about a historical figure when their monument is being debated and questioned than you did, because for all those monuments in the spotlight, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of others that languish in the background. But I was thinking, as you were saying that, Kijo, about a monumental figure in Ohio, the late Nobel laureate Toni Morrison. And something that sits with me, sits with a lot of scholars, artists, and others is from her profound germinal essay, The Site of Memory. And she and other writing at that moment, and just something that sticks out to me, something that she said in the late 1980s. She said, there's no place, and I'm paraphrasing, there's no place you or I can go or not go to summon the presence or absence of enslaved peoples. There's no memorial, there's no skyscraper lobby, there's no bench by the road. And she lists a lot of other memorial monumental forms. And she said, and because of that, the book has to do it. And she's speaking about the writing of Beloved, a book about haunting, profoundly. And I think about that and I think, okay, here we are decades later, and we have no national memorial on the Mall in Washington. We do have national park sites like the President's House in Philadelphia, sites to Harry Tubman and Frederick Douglass by the National Park Service. We have not, in a memorial sense, reckoned with the history of slavery. We definitely haven't in a financial one as well. If you read or look into the 1619 Project, the important work, #1 New York Times bestseller right now, to understand how the past fits in with the present. So I sit with Toni Morrison's words, and also with what the Toni Morrison Society, a group of people who rallied around her profound contributions, who started dedicating benches by the road in places of racial trauma and transformation around the country. And at Toni Morrison's memorial service, a bench by the road was there, and there's one, I believe, at the Schomburg. And so just what does it mean to bring together loss and also the story of struggle and finding your way through against all odds? And that is history, profoundly, that we should be putting our attention on as well, and already do. We're catching up.
Absolutely.
Something that interests me is how complex monuments are and how changeable they are. So again, I speak as a historian of the ancient world and the Byzantine world, and one of the things that wealthy people used to do is pay a lot of money to build monuments in their cities to make their cities more beautiful. And one of the things that they were doing by making them more beautiful is saying, here am I, right? This is a statement of power. But they were also giving something to the citizens of the city. A lot of these were major monumental water fountains that provided water for the passersby, et cetera. So monuments can have layers, and they aren't always just one thing in any given moment, and they're certainly not one thing over time, as we saw in the example of Palmyra. And, you know, you and I have talked about history and issues of being anti-racist and engaging with the reality of our positions in the world as being messy.
Yes.
You know, as
Yes.
being messy. And I think messy is actually a good word to embrace, to acknowledge that there isn't a single story about monuments, and there isn't a single dimension to monuments. And we have to be willing to acknowledge loss. We have to be willing to acknowledge what's not in the archive, what's missing, what has been excluded from the archive, and hope to come to another place. How can we repair and reimagine how history lives with us every day?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to your point, it is very messy, but there's also, you know, these places for immense joy that happen around these, happen around central objects. And so it can be, as you say, really complicated, and we've talked about positionality and all those things and what rises to the surface depending upon where you are, what you're doing that particular moment. But I want to also sort of recuperate an idea of, and joy is the word that I'm going to use, is because for me it is also joyous to unearth or to sit in those spaces of loss. There is a certain element, because there is a maybe it's like that relief that you felt at seeing the ruins. It's like an, oh, yes, let's acknowledge, like let's be here. And let's be here as painfully as it is, but together. And so to me, that is an aspect that I think is so essential, right, to considering not only repair and reimagining, but also resting. Right? So there's a constant sort of striving in this moment of how do we fix, how do we fix, how do we fix? And I want to understand how we rest with the complicated, how we rest with the painful for a moment. Because even as the statues are toppled, have those spaces truly shifted? What's happening around them? Are there still disparities around the citizenry that live in those spaces? Is it like what happens is a new monument erected that looks nice for everyone, that acknowledges a particular moment in history, but does not shift the concrete lives of the people that are living around it? And so to my understanding, I'm thinking about how monuments impact the concrete lives of the people around them as well. So yeah.
I'd like to pick up on this notion of joy, because we've been talking a lot about struggle and strife with respect to monuments. And, you know, monuments have given me the most joy in my life. I mean, working in Upper Egypt at this late antique monastic church that was completely blackened inside when I first walked into it, and step by step watching these extraordinary paintings be revealed by master conservators, Italian conservators that I worked with. It was such a privilege. It was such a privilege to see this beauty being unfolded. And I, of course, have had that experience around the world at other great monuments, the Taj Mahal, and there's a lot of joy that monuments bring us, as well as being markers of social challenges and problems and terrible pasts.
Yeah. I think you were starting to get at this idea around intentionality. That's what I was hearing. And we talk to city leaders and municipal officers and folks at institutions who will say, okay, what do we do with the monuments? And one of the first things we ask is like, well, what's your actual intention? And if the intention is to make a problem go away or fix, that's not a project we really like to work with. Because I think that's not the time frame of memory. That's not the time frame of repair. You have to move at the speed of trust. And I think that it's really important to highlight the notion of intentionality to any memory-based process, because there isn't one answer, and at the same time, there are learnings and lessons that we can have. One of the things I'm going to say, and just in that notion of also sitting with loss and the messiness, I'm struck by how profound images of organizing, of creativity, of people-powered commemoration that exists around the world. I think about Marcus David Peters Circle in Richmond, of George Floyd Square in Minneapolis. And I want to kind of go back to those places, spaces of joy and justice, and spaces where it wasn't from official decree that not just a place changed, but the world changed from that place. Right? I was just in Minneapolis a few weeks ago, and still George Floyd Square, the autonomous zone, is a profound site of pain and memory. And when you enter in from any four intersections, there's a list of demands right there that the organizers have put. They're very clear about how memory and futures fit together, but also right in the present. So I think about those spaces as profound, but then I go back and I think about what we learned through the audit, things that we did not know before it. Because, there's some of those findings, you did not need an audit to let you know the demographics of the monument landscape, And I just want to be really clear on that, because maybe to the point about the archive, there's only so much the data can tell you. A lot of it is lived with you. But understanding that the amount of attention, even just for Monument Lab, that we've received in conversations about what to do with monuments and where will they live, and understanding that 99.4% of them were not toppled in the last 2 years, means that a lot of our conversation has been about the changing dynamics and not the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that we have inherited symbols of the past that have largely been lightly tracked by profoundly understaffed and under-resourced entities that are meant to steward them. They have been a part of profound changes in cities and towns, and that, what do we do with them? I understand that there are a handful of museums, and the museums and other institutions are where our mind goes. I'm curious about learning from the places that people have dealt with those absences. And again, just thinking about, where does place memory live? It lives with all of us, and how do we strive for fuller, more complex? I think that the profound pushback against the 1619 project about just telling the story as it is, like just getting all the facts out there. You can sense when there's a fear of telling, not just a fear of telling the full story, but specific erasures around histories of racism, of sexism, of homophobia in our country. You're like, wait a second, why all that heat? What's going on? And it's at a moment where there is joy afoot. There is a profound sense in looking at the past and animating it that a lot of people I know drawing a lot of inspiration from.
Yeah.
That's profound.
Really, and thank you, Paul. No, and that's a perfect place, I think, to turn to our audience. So we have microphones at either end of the aisles here. If you have any questions or comments for any of us, we would love to hear from you, whether it's about your idea of place memory, if you want to talk about a monument here in Cleveland, if you have questions about Monument Lab or the project at all, please feel free to come forward.
Hi, I just want to say that the most profound monument, I can consider it a monument, that I've ever experienced that is contrary to the old sense of loss and slavery is what's happening in Montgomery, Alabama. Have you been there?
I have, yeah.
What's it called? The National Memorial to Peace and Justice is the most profound thing that counters that slavery image in the past. But I'm also wondering, on the other side, I hope you're aware that we are sitting at the entrance of the largest garden dedicated with monuments of peace in the world. I mean, our cultural gardens, and I was just wondering what you could say about that and what that says about Cleveland, that while all these negative statues were going up around the country, here in Cleveland, we created statues to peace and writers and, Gandhi and Goethe, and they're just minutes away. And so what does that say about Cleveland?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, and thank you for bringing Montgomery, Alabama into this. I think that the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice is a profoundly important site for us to learn from. I had the great opportunity to go earlier this year. And it's a memorial and a museum and a legal institution that was founded by Bryan Stevenson. A lot of you folks already know this, but for anyone in the room who might not, it's worth just appreciating their contributions. Bryan Stevenson, as a lawyer, first sought to deal with the legacies of slavery in our contemporary justice system, and has been a lawyer who's argued on at the Supreme Court, really fighting for a pronounced and systemic approach to injustice by way of racism in our country. And we kept finding stories of how the past lives into the present, including many, upwards of more than 4,000 lynchings across the country, and has worked to respond in legal ways, but also in healing community-based remembrance. And so the site in Montgomery is also connected to many communities around the country. I also want to just say, when we were there, we were able to meet someone who's a collaborator with Monument Lab on our regeneration project, Michelle Browder and her team just down the street from EJI, the Moore-Up campus. They've dedicated a remarkable project called the Mothers of Gynecology. And at this very moment that we're thinking about the needs to think about reproductive justice, speaking of the Supreme Court and the need to protect reproductive justice, that's another important site to look up. I think just quickly, just in terms of what we're saying, I feel like we are learning a lot. Every time we come here, we're students of it. We want to learn what's going on in the city. And every time we ask a question or hear from one of our colleagues here or someone we meet, there's more intrigue. And so I think rather than like it's good here or bad somewhere else, or it's right or wrong, like I think that part of what we're most interested in doing is actually just asking questions. Like I'm thinking about, we had this round table, which you'll hear more about, and out the window we are seeing a statue to noted Polish American Kosciuszko, and like we were like, wait, who is that? He happens to be on our top 50 list from our audit. And just like, oh, there's all these monuments we didn't look at before. We just drove by and we took them for granted. So I would say, without appreciating the cultural gardens, like taking a moment to look at them and see why. The last thing I just want to say, because you talked about peace, last thing here, it was astonishing to learn that the idea from our audit that every time you see a monument to peace, that even mentions peace, you're going to see at least 10 more times monuments to war. For every one monument that mentions the word care, you'll see 59 to war. And just think about what we've been through and how we can think about new ways to foster commemoration around conquest and war, and also understand what we need to do to heal and repair.
I think the cultural gardens are really an extraordinary testament to appreciation for diversity in this city. And that's not to say that there aren't very, very, very serious social problems and problems of inequity in the city, but those gardens really are a testament to the human spirit. And I think personally, I'm proud to be in a city where they exist, but I also want to talk about another source of pride, and that is the exchange that this museum made with the government of Cambodia around some monumental statues, and that story is told in the exhibition of Krishna. And I think it's remarkable in this time of museums trying to cling to what they have in their collections, that there was so much openness and willingness to send things back to Cambodia, and that generated trust, and then that meant that other parts of a monumental statue here came, and it was possible to tell this huge story. I think we need to sit with loss and sorrow and rage, but I also think we need to sit with joy and pride, and it's not just one kind of thing. And beauty, beauty. We haven't talked about beauty in monuments. Oh my
true.
gosh, what's wrong with me?
It's true. There's no single story, and I
Yeah.
think as you witness each panel unfold, you will see that every single participant has a different way of understanding or making an entry into monuments. And as we're about to wrap up this panel, I just want to say that, you know, we will be inviting you to ask questions throughout, and there will be things that you may agree with that we say, things that you disagree with, points that we don't know. I thank you for bringing up the cultural gardens. It's not a space that I've spent enough time in, but it is one of the, it's, you know, driving down MLK Boulevard. I am used to in most cities that I spend time in, MLK Boulevard is in the hood, is typically embedded in Black neighborhoods. That is not to say that that's not what was there previously. And the idea that it's this sort of winding, beautiful, bucolic green road really appeals to me in particular ways. So I want to say that one of the things that we do lose often in narratives around not just monuments, but history, is that there have always been counter narratives. There have always been that press through that you were pointing to, Paul, and the kinds of joy that happens in the context of all of these other things happening, because that is the way life truly works. And so with that, I want to thank Professor Bolman and Paul for being with me up here today.